Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
Our conversation this time round is called The Inevitable Shipwreck. Now, shipwrecks aren't inevitable, Mike, are they? So
at least you hope they're not going to be, David.
There's going to be some surprises here. Who's at the centre of this story?
This is going to be a story that will focus around the Apostle Paul and how he ended up on a boat heading for Rome and how disaster struck on the way.
Where does the story begin in the Bible?
It's a story covered in Acts chapter 27 and 28. And just to set that in context, Paul has completed now 3 missionary journeys and he's returned to Jerusalem. The timescale now, it's AD 57. And while he's there in Jerusalem visiting the temple, some Jews accuse him of preaching against the temple and against Judaism and against the law. They've misinterpreted his teaching, and they also accuse him of bringing Gentiles into the temple area. Long story short, it led to a riot. The Roman soldiers came to break it up. Paul gets arrested, and out of that, he ends up appearing before the Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish council. They pass him on to the Roman governor, Felix, who keeps him in jail for 2 years. I mean, I just noticed that again as I reread the story, and I think, my goodness, 2 years and really nothing's happening apart from the odd interview with the governor. And then Festus, his successor, wants to carry on with that process. Every time Paul gets to appear before the governor, he takes the opportunity to preach about Jesus. He's not going to let anything stop him. But eventually, Paul just gets fed up with the whole process. He thinks, oh my goodness, this is going nowhere. I think I've preached the gospel enough to you lot now. And eventually he says those words, I appeal to Caesar. Now, why does he do that? Well, because he was a Roman citizen. Although he was a Jew, his father had acquired Roman citizenship and therefore he had that himself. And every Roman citizen had the right to appeal direct to Caesar. So Paul does that, is therefore sent off to Rome via an appearance before Herod Agrippa. But in Acts 27, he's put on a ship that sets out towards Rome. They change ships at a place called Myra, which is now on the southern coast of Turkey. And it's on the boat that they take from there, heading towards Italy, because Paul has appealed to have his case heard by Caesar, that he ends up in the scenario that we're looking at today.
Who is on this boat? And you say boat, is it a small boat, a large boat, a ship? I mean, who's on that boat with him?
It's a trading ship. So, by our standards, they weren't big. Some of these vessels that crossed the Mediterranean in those days, I certainly wouldn't want to travel on them. But he sort of hitches a lift with the Roman centurion in whose charge he's been put to cross over to Italy. It's actually an Alexandrian ship, and they were particularly noted for sort of carrying lots of cargo. And so there in southern Turkey, the Roman centurion finds this Alexandrian ship that was sailing for Italy, pays their passage, and they both get on board.
So this is quite a journey and facing potentially some terrible weather.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sea travel was not always straightforward in those days. Actually, most Jews hated going anywhere near the sea. They were really a landlubbing people. Sea journeys were pretty dangerous. And this one, will be all the more dangerous because it is getting into winter when the bad weather comes. And as they start the journey at the beginning of Acts 27, it just starts with the wind not allowing us to hold our course. Then they lose time because they have to sail along the wrong side of Crete. They would normally have taken a faster journey. Time starts to get lost. Actually, there's a verse where Paul warns them, "Men, I can see our voyage is going to be dangerous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." So even Paul, as a landlubber, could see this is getting really dangerous now. Interesting what follows. The centurion, instead of listening to what Paul had said, followed the advice of the pilot of the ship and the owner of the ship. Now, of course, the owner's got vested interests, hasn't he? Money trumps everything. He wants the cargo to get to where it's supposed to be going. And although Paul has counseled them against continuing, the owner tells the pilot, keep pressing on. Money trumps all here, doesn't it? And, well, the weather, frankly, predictably, so this is not a surprise in the story, the weather turns worse, and there is this incredible storm that comes their way. By the way, the detail in Acts 27 about this storm is incredible. It really is eyewitness detail. Now, we know that Luke, the author of Acts, joined Paul at a certain point in his journeys, and this suggests that Luke is most definitely with them here because of the amount of detail that's given.
And you mentioned that Paul had completed 3 missionary journeys, so he's travelled well. He's sailed before. This isn't the first time he's been on a ship.
Absolutely. The guy's sailed many times on his 3 missionary journeys to this point. So, yeah, he's not completely unfamiliar with sailing and some of the challenges that it would have had. But clearly, what they faced here was really quite exceptional. In fact, it might just be good to read the few verses that tell us about it. From Acts 27:13, we read that when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they'd obtained what they wanted. Here's our break. Come on, let's go for it. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship to hold it together. That's what they used to do. They'd pass these ropes around the ship to pull the planks in tight. Fearing they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Oh my goodness, the very thing that had led the owner to make them continue this journey, they now have to abandon. On the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. In other words, anything that they don't need is going overboard to lighten the ship, so there's no risk of it being swamped and going to the bottom of the ocean. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Did you notice that? We finally gave up. Luke was most certainly there with them. This is a pretty rough scenario, isn't it? Yet really, David, none of that should be a surprise. It was the wrong time for sailing. You know, there were certain seasons when they sailed and certain seasons when they didn't, when the winds were going to be against them, when the storms were likely, and yet money had driven the owner of the ship to continue with this journey.
So through the owner's selfishness, he was putting his own crew at risk.
He absolutely was putting them and everyone at risk. So it's at this most risky moment. And again, as I've said often in this series, put yourself in the picture. Imagine how it must have been at this point. It really must have been quite terrifying. Even seasoned sailors fear that this is going to be the end for them. But it's at this point of greatest challenge, greatest risk, that we get our first surprise in this story. And it's the surprise of an angel appearing to Paul and telling him, against what would seem to be the evidence of their eyes that not one person will be lost.
So there they are in the middle of the ocean. An angel comes from nowhere, and Paul sees this angel and hears this angel by the sound of it.
And passes on what he's heard to his fellow shipmates. Let's read those verses. Verse 21 says, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. For last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.
Now, these sailors are going to think he's absolutely bonkers.
They probably do, but, there was a great deal of belief, particularly among Romans, of the gods appearing, helping you, coming at certain times. So I suspect they didn't dismiss it, perhaps as quickly as some people might do today.
I suppose they're glad to hang on to any hope, really.
Oh, I think at this point you'd take whatever was coming your way, wouldn't you? Of course, it doesn't change immediately. It's interesting, the very next verse says, on the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. So they've still now got another 14 days. Interesting, isn't it? God speaks, but the rescue isn't immediate. Sometimes there is a delay between God speaking and God acting, and there certainly was in this case.
And of course, they could have avoided this. I mean, it's largely down to their own stupidity, isn't it, that they've ended up like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, Paul was, not slow to remind them of that. As a pastor, I've often heard, particularly non-Christians, saying, why did God allow this? And everything within me wants to say, well, why did you make your stupid decision in the first place? And now you're blaming God because it's gone wrong and expecting him to rescue right here and now. So yeah, if they'd only listened, actually, if they'd listened to Paul, if they'd listened to common sense, if they'd listened to their experience, everything about their experience said, don't go out now. We've missed the slot. We've got delayed on that first ship, and in the early parts of the journey of this second ship that they crossed to, we had unfavorable winds. We got delayed. We just need to pull in, sit this out and wait. But of course, why didn't they? Money. The owner of the ship had made his investment and he wanted his return. Of course, he'll end up losing everything.
I suppose Paul, hearing what he heard from this angel, he could have sort of kept it to himself and thought, I wonder whether that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, but of course, for Paul, he's always looking for every opportunity to preach, isn't he? And he's very clear there, my God, the God that I serve and who's called me. And I'm sure he went on to say more than that. We've only got the summary of the conversations here. So for Paul, this was an opportunity to give glory to God. He didn't want this just as reassurance for himself. Oh, it's okay. Don't worry, Paul. It will be all right. No, he's going to make the most of this and share this with the rest.
So despite the circumstances, how did Paul handle it?
He handles it in the most incredible way. We left it where they were starting to sense that they were coming closer towards the coast. Obviously, in terrible weather, you can't always even see the coast, can you? And they realize they're getting closer, then they fear that, maybe they're going to strike rocks. Actually, it's interesting. Some of the sailors themselves at this point even attempt to lower the lifeboat from the ship and to get into it and to escape. They were going to leave everyone to their deserts so they could see where it was going. So the crisis seems to be getting worse. And they only stop that happening by Paul alerting them and the soldiers cutting the ropes of the lifeboat, and it's now drifting away. So the sailors, whom they need their skills, of course, to survive. So all of this going on, but how does Paul respond to this, you ask me? Well, here's another surprise in the story. He is utterly at peace. I find this next bit of the story staggering, really. Let's read on. Verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. My goodness, this is really rough, isn't it? Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and he gave thanks to God in front of them all, and he broke it and he began to eat. And then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. And when they'd eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So there goes more profit into the sea. But what a surprise here for everyone else, that in the midst of this terrible scenario that's gone on now for the last 2 weeks, is getting worse rather than better. The sailors even want to give up and abandon ship. Paul is utterly at peace. He knows that God has spoken. God spoke through that angel appearing. He is now convinced they will all be saved. So what can he do? He says, do you know what we need to do, guys? It's a while since we've eaten. Come on, we need to eat. And he breaks bread and he gives thanks to the living God for it. And out of that, he encourages the others to do the same. Wow, what incredible peace he got there in the midst of the storm.
It would have been more natural, more normal, dare I say, to just panic.
I'm sure there had been plenty of that on the boat at this moment. But you see, the key thing for Paul that changed panic to peace is he's heard God. He's heard God. And when you hear God, when you know that you know that you know God has spoken, an incredible peace can come into your heart that you don't, this is not a sort of, come on now, come on, David, we're going to muster up peace here between us and try and set a good example. No, this is not Paul mustering peace. This is Paul receiving peace, the gift of God. Jesus said, my peace I give to you, my peace I leave with you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. There can be a supernatural peace in moments of crisis that is the gift of God. Actually, I had an experience of that myself a few years ago. I was on one of my ministry trips, this time to Kenya, and I was in the city of Nairobi, where I'd been doing some preaching and teaching. But before we'd gone, the leaders of the church had gathered to pray over me. That was our custom, to pray, send people out, see if we got any words of encouragement or direction as we went. And the wife of one of the leaders, who I know really well, trust really well, she's a woman with her feet really down on the ground, though a passionate lover of Jesus, said to me, Mike, I don't want to make you anxious, but I really feel God says that on this trip, you're going to face a situation of danger. Now, I knew, she wasn't prone to panic and she wasn't trying to scare me and unnerve me. She was honestly trying to share what she felt God had said. And I really did trust this lady. She said, I feel you're going to face a situation of danger, but God says to you, when the danger comes, stay still. Stay still. And I remember still her sort of pointing at me with her finger as she was saying this to the beat of the words, stay still, stay still. And then, of course, they prayed for me. God would protect me. So off I went on this trip to Kenya, ended up in Nairobi. We've got to the very last day of the trip. Of course, I'd been really careful through the whole trip. I'd watched everything, taken great care, prayed every day, God protect me. We got to the last day. One of the young guys from the church that I'd taken on the trip with me, we'd gone out shopping in Nairobi to get some presents for our kids at that point, and we were just about to go back to the place where we'd been staying to pack our bags and set off for the airport. And so I was crossing this main road in the centre of Nairobi, and as I got to the far side of the road, there were cars parked all along it, alongside it, and so I walked between the front end of one car, the back end of the other, to get to the pavement. But what I'd not seen was there was a patch of oil on the ground between them. And as I walked between the two cars, my foot slipped on the oil and I fell backwards into this road. And as I looked down the road, I saw this old Land Rover racing towards me. Now, it was one of the big old-style Land Rovers, big, heavy, big overhang at the front, big beast of a thing, racing towards me. And of course, everything in me at that moment thought, I'm going to get hit, I'm going to get killed, and it's all in microseconds, these thoughts going through your mind. But at that moment, as I saw the Land Rover coming, Mary's voice came back to me. When you face danger, God says, stay still, stay still. Now, of course, that's the very last thing that you would want to do in that situation. You'd want to get up as fast as you can. But some supernatural peace took over. I can't even say I remembered her words. God brought those words back to me. They suddenly came into my mind. Stay still, stay still. So I did exactly that. As the driver slammed on his brakes and stopped his vehicle with his front tyre 1 inch away from my head. Now, anyone who knows anything about old Land Rovers will know they've got a big overhang at the front, particularly those models that are used out in Africa very often that have to be really rugged. And I realised that had I tried to get up, what would have happened is, in fact, my head would have been smashed in the front of this Land Rover. But by staying still, the front overhang went over my head and the tyre stopped 1 inch away from me. It really does remind me of this sort of story that could be life or death. But you know what? God had spoken. I'd taken hold of that word. I'd prayed into it day after day. When the moment came, God reminded me of it. I stayed still and stayed in his peace, and my life was spared. And that's what happened to Paul that day. He was utterly at peace, an utter surprise for everyone else who must have been terrified and panicked. But Paul could be at peace, not because he didn't understand the severity of the situation, but because he understood the strength of God's word to him.
So how did things unfold for Paul and the others on this boat?
Here's the surprise for everyone except Paul. Every single person survived. Eventually, I just jumped to the end of the story. The ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and wouldn't move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding surf. And the soldiers had planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. So he ordered that those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. And chapter 27 ends with these words: in this way, everyone reached land in safety. Everyone. Why? Because the angel from God had told Paul not one life would be lost. A huge surprise for everyone else, really to be expected as far as Paul was concerned.
And so that was the shipwreck, which was inevitable.
It was inevitable. It was inevitable, well, first of all, because they had made stupid decisions. If you make stupid decisions in life, then you have to live with the consequences. we are well aware at the moment, for example, of the effects of global warming. If we continue to do the stuff that will continue to warm the planet, then I'm sorry, but there are inevitable consequences. So at that level, the shipwreck was inevitable. They set out when they shouldn't have done. Of course, at another level, it was inevitable because Paul had this word that there would be a shipwreck, but that God would preserve and protect every life. So it was inevitable at two levels, really.
So they get to land safely, and then does all go swimmingly?
Oh, yeah, wonderfully. Well, until there's another surprise. They actually get to land and discover that where they've landed is the island of Malta. Still today, there's a place called St. Paul's Bay. I've stood there on the beach and looked out to where this shipwreck happened. And we read that the islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. And Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. And when the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." So they think that, the gods have seen what's happened here. This guy's going to get his comeuppance, and clearly the viper must have been poisonous, or they wouldn't have said what they did. The surprise is out of the frying pan into the fire, isn't it? After all he's been through, you think, my goodness, what is this guy facing? But here's the surprise. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Of course, Paul wouldn't have let them keep that for very long, and the story goes on to say of how they go to the home of a local official, and there they're welcomed and cared for. And Paul takes the opportunity to do, guess what? Yes, to preach about Jesus again. Nothing's going to get in the way of that happening for him.
And this is Luke, the doctor, recording this, who would know a thing or two about poisonous snakes.
Oh, he'd probably seen a few people come in with those, hadn't he? And clearly there is the expectation that Paul was going to die. This was not just unpleasant. They're waiting, watching for the guy to die. So, yeah, this was certainly pretty nasty. Interesting, though, the end of Mark's gospel has got that little bit about when you go out to take the gospel, you'll pick up poisonous snakes and they will not harm you. That is not meant to be authentication for what happens in some of those little churches in America, the snake handlers, where they pick up snakes to prove how much faith they've got. What rather is being thought of there is the sort of thing that happened for Paul. It's a way of saying nothing will stop you as you go out in my name, Jesus says, to preach this good news. No, not even poisonous snakes. You'll pick them up and they won't harm you. It's exactly what happened here in this story with Paul.
Who doesn't seem to think too much about himself. He seems to be more concerned for others.
It's true, isn't it? All the way through the story. He's concerned for the others. He's concerned that not a single life is lost. Why is he able to do that? Probably a couple of reasons. One is Paul knows that even if his life is lost, he's got a hope in heaven. This is not the end of him. But I think also because he really had heard what God had said. When you know God has spoken, you can stand on that. And so he doesn't have to put his own life first. Why? Because God had said his life's not going to be lost. And so he can therefore selflessly think of others and seek to do whatever he can to help them get through this situation. And it's interesting. Why do they all survive? Because of the counsel of the landlubber. Not the pilot, not the captain, not the owner, not the soldiers, not the sailors, but this landlubber, this man who had heard from God and was determined to stand on it, believe it, live it out, and who ended up living in the good of it.
In conclusion, Paul sets quite an example for us all.
an example that no matter what situation we might be in, keep looking to God, keep open to God, keep listening for God's word. That is why reading the Bible each day in a systematic way is so important and so helpful, because day by day we are giving God the chance to speak his word to us. And I cannot tell you, David, the number of times that from my reading that day, a verse has come that has spoken either into a situation I've been in or that has been useful for a situation that has arisen that day. Our God is a God who speaks to us. He's not silent in heaven. He loves to speak. And the Bible is one of the chief ways he does that. Of course, he does it through other ways too, through that inner voice in our heart, through prophetic words, whatever it might be. But he's a great example to us to, hey, listen to God, take hold of what God says, and simply stand in it and see what God will do for you.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.